Okay, my goal today in terms of theoretical aspects, I want to get you the skeleton, the basic introduction into neural network architectures and also the so-called stochastic gradient descent algorithm. Okay, we'll begin with elementary things. As I told you, the online textbook, the so-called deep learning book that we have in the syllabus, has chapter 2 and chapter 3 basically deal with basic linear algebra and also basic statistics, probably a statistic that you'd need. So you can review those and brush on them if you've seen it before, so this is a good time to really look at those chapters. We're really going to begin with the core of what neural networks are. And these are the 3 items that I'm hoping to cover today. I'm going to zip through it. It's going to basically become undergraduate calculus. People in electrical engineering, often they're very good in linear algebra, differential equations. People in computer science, often they don't have this material covered very well, and they actually right now, they're changing the whole programs in computer science to include linear algebra and probability statistics. So if you have any questions, of course, about any of the linear algebra statistics, come and ask. We have office hours immediately after class for the same duration of the class. So we begin neurons and neural networks. So let me see if I can succeed in moving this page. So the motivations from neurobiology, the core element is the neuron, and in a simple possible way, make it like universal structure. A neuron has branches called dendrites that receive data from neighboring other neurons. And this data will be integrated, okay, in analog form, accumulated into the so-called soma, which is the cell body, okay? So there's an integration aspect of analog incoming signals, okay? And then the soma, in addition to the integration, also basically performs some nonlinearity called thresholding, in a way. Or in the soma here integrates all these incoming signals from the branches, then it initiates at the axon hillock a spike, which is a representation that the incoming data is, for example, in a simple way, is above a certain level. So it creates a spike. So the creation of spikes happens at the axon hillock, which is the beginning of the axon. Now the spike that's going to run through the axon is going to be a representation of the information in a way, in a digital form. Spike, which is like a digital form. And often people look at the rate of firing, which amounts to be the frequency of firing of these spikes. But also nowadays, people look also at the phase to compare one spike from one neuron to another neuron. So the total phase is the key information or a key variable that carries the information about this processing. So you have a stream of spikes running through, and then at the end of this axon is going to latch on onto other dendrites. This is in the typical form. Sometimes latch on other axons as well. And the key notion of when it latch on to another dendrite, there's a gap, and there's something called synapse, which is people in neuroscience believe that's where the core learning takes place. So the synapse is basically a gap. One side of it is coming, let's say, from the axon, the other side from the receiving end, which could be a dendrite. And in between, there's liquid. Now, those spikes, as they fire, they're in electrical form. They come at the end of the axon. Spike firing triggers vesicles with excitatory and inhibitory molecules to release that contain chemicals, and they release those chemicals through the gap. Those chemicals go on the other side of the membrane. They latch on and basically channels. They either open a channel or close a channel to permit fluid transmission across the membrane. And the fluid transmission gives rise to an analog signal that's created that will be in a way related to the frequency of firing or the rate of firing. So basically, digital information, chemical processing, the chemical processing latch on, let's say, the membrane of a dendrite, and that transforms this digital representation into an analog information that represents the strength, and then the analog signal goes to this neuron. And that's really what the core processing is, at least in a skeleton universal form. Okay? So I have written here the dendrite, cell body, which is a soma, axon, synapse with synaptic gap, and dendrites of other neurons. So that's how basically this unit is used to create a network of those things. There's no limit on how the connectivity is taking place. There are a lot of different forms, and there's a lot of diversity in the brain. There are a lot of different populations of neurons that interact in different ways. There's some neurons that basically hook up from axon to dendrites. There's some dendrite to dendrite or axon to axon. So all different kind of variety of integration. The key thing is the observations that we can summarize, or at least some key things, that there's an analog processing, there's a digital processing. So sometimes this is referred to as a mixed mode kind of or hybrid processing, which really translates to representation of the signal, one form or the other, depending on the platform that the signal is using, whether it's this wet or biology or another wet biology. So this models a single neuron. If we go to the next, from engineering, this description I have, you could detail it. And as I listed here, actually the synaptic gap, which often in engineering and the simple models we have, we just represent it by a scaling factor to a signal. As you're going to see here in a second, these are the simple models we use. The original model, the true modeling of the gap itself could be via a transfer function, could be via a differential equation or partial differential, could be very complex because you have a stream of chemical populations that are transferred from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane. Each one has its own dynamics and transient behavior and what have you, okay? But to simplify things, we can have a diagram like this that represents a single neuron with a dendrite just collecting analog information, and the cell body basically integrating it or transforming it. And then on top of that, it performs a thresholding, which gives rise to a transformation of the signal from an analog to a digital form. It goes along the axon. You have a synaptic gap. This synaptic gap is loaded in terms of people associated with learning capability. And it's something that's dynamically changing. So if you eat a pizza or eat a healthy food, that's going to eventually translate to a chemical that gives you perhaps a better memory or worse memory, because that's how all these connect. So dynamic kind of processing. Okay? So at this point, I'm going to ask if you have any questions about this schematic and this particular single neuron block, that we're going to use it as a building block to creating networks. Any questions? Okay. So we can take this diagram that we have here, and we're going to translate it into some mathematical equations that represents engineering for us. So we say, okay, dendrites, we're going to have another signal. Number one, the focus is on the spiking of signals along the axon. So this is the spike. So if you really want to be a good modeler, you say, this is a spike, I have to represent it as something with a phase and rate, okay? But what we've done initially here, we're leaving the complex models for other purposes, but for engineering compact model, because we're going to take this single neuron, we're going to create a huge networks, and we have to worry about computational efforts and complexity, okay? So the variable V here, which represents the output of the cell body, which represents something about the spiking neurons, could represent the rate of firing of these spikes. So represent it as an analog value, okay? Also could represent the probability of firing, okay? So we take, or the average of firing. All these are basically signals that you could use, and then you say what every neuron is outputting is really a variable, as analog signal, in this case VI, and that analog signal represents either the average of the firing or the probability of firing, okay, and so on. So you need basically that stream of firing that comes out represented that way. And this nonlinearity represents the decision the cell body makes to create that particular signal, which in a simple way represented by nonlinearity that has what we refer to here as a compressive nonlinearity. In this case, you have a nonlinearity which could be represented as a function, hyperbolic tangent, or sigmoidal function. More recently, people look at the rectified linear models and what have you. There are a lot of different nonlinearity, and nonlinearity renders this model nonlinear, and therefore we're not applying any linear signal processing techniques. It becomes purely nonlinear at the neuron level. So V sub j here is the rate of firing, let's say, or the probability of firing from other neurons, jth neuron. Going through the synapse, we represent it simply, in this case, a transformation of that rate to some quantity, and the simplest form, we just scale it, which we call a weight. If you really want to be authentic about it, you could say this is not just a scaling factor, this is a transformation of some sort. And depending on the complex model you can live with, you can make a transfer function, digital differential equation, whatever, okay? So in this case, typically people just scale that signal by some factor, weight, which really transforms the incoming signal. So it comes from at the end of the axon, when it latches at the membrane of the dendrite, that value of the signal, which we take here to be the mean or the probability of firing, is transformed. You sum all the incoming signal to that single neuron, and that becomes what goes into the cell body, represented here by U sub I. And then there's this threshold, meaning that when the integrated sum is, for a simplest way, above a certain level, the cell body says, okay, I'm going to initiate firing. If it's below a certain level, I'm not going to fire. So the cell body makes a decision at what point to start firing, and also at what rate. Start with a small rate or high rate and what have you. So the variable V here represents the rate of firing of the signal, and so on and so forth. Okay. Then, of course, you can, once you have this cartoon model of a single neuron, and I'm saying cartoon here to just remind ourselves that we are abstracting these models for the purpose of scaling it up and have an engineering application, okay? So you can have observation about what the biology is telling us, with the latest information from biology, and also we can create networks. And obviously, you want to have a universal form of networks, okay? You want to have a modular form of networks. You don't want to just have arbitrary networks. You want to have things that you can scale and you articulate, you can program, and you can take advantage of. So synapses are localized learning elements. So presumably, the learning capacity is localized at every synapse of every neuron. Dendrites integrate analog signals, and we tell you the spiking it would have. So this is just a summary of things that I'm mentioning, and then here I'm giving you some properties, things that we know. For example, if I focus on the axon, in this model, the axon is just a wire, transmission wire. Just a wire that transfers the firing, the output of a single neuron to another neuron. In reality, obviously, this wire has dissipation, has capacitive. If you really want to get into it, there are a lot of detailed models about the true biological things. But because it's not essential characteristics for what we intend to do, we drop basically that and just make it as a transmission wire. And typically what people have adopted, or at least the consensus is, you have two modes of modeling. One is multi-layers, feed forward. Okay, signal path is just moving forward. Okay, from input to a final output, and anything in between is referred to as hidden layers. And you look at it layers because truly in the cortex, the visual cortex, it's been observed that you have basically layering of populations of neurons. Neurons are organized in certain layering, so basically signal travel from one layer to the next layer. Now keep in mind that the brain has a lot of different compartments, a lot of different portions, and every portion has its own unique characteristics. Some parts of the brain are done for pre-processing, and so on and so forth. Any questions? So, feed forward, we just have a signal that travels from input and goes to a final thing, and anything in between is going to be called a hidden layer, or internal layer, or representation layer. Nowadays, the people use the word representation to remind ourselves what we're doing by this forward processing is that we're taking an incoming signal, let's say an image of something, and we have a cascade of transformations. And the known results now that these transformations basically transform or have a representation of these images in some different coordinate systems, where eventually at the end of this block of transformations, these different images that relate to one another could be classified or clusters in different regions that simplifies a single layer neural network to do a classification or detection. Okay? So it's a representation of an image whereby similar things become basically physically close in the mathematical model we have. Okay. Any questions? Any comments? Okay, so let's move on. So in this model, the only parameters are really in the connection, which is from the output of one neuron to the input or the dendrite of another neuron. And we have, in this case, we have a parameter called T in the previous slide, which sometimes you call it W or U or whatever, some parameter. And the learning association in this simple model say, okay, I have a parameter which needs to be determined, and depending on the application that I use, there exists a unique, or at least a set of unique parameters that will solve that application for me. So what do we mean by this? So obviously in the application say, okay, what is your application? For example, some application detection or classification. Often you have a label of a class. You have some training data, as we talked about last time. And use that training data, which you have an input signal corresponding label, and use that under the umbrella of supervised learning, meaning I'm given a label, I want to do the training, supervised learning, and in engineering or in computer science or computing or physics, what have you, in science, the goal is to determine that parameter that will give you the best performance on the training data, but also on the so-called validation or testing data. And as I mentioned last time, when you get a data, either you or somebody has done it for you already, you partition that data into a set that's called training data, another set that's called validation data, and often, sometimes, another set that's called testing data. And what I mentioned last time, repeating it again, the training data, use it in whatever algorithm, supervised learning, for example, okay, use that data in training the network, meaning that you have those parameters initiated from some initial guess, because you don't know any better, you just start arbitrary parameters. If you know some good choices, you choose those. And then you have a mechanism such as gradient descent to steer you incrementally towards a good solution. What is a good solution? Your performance, accuracy performance on the training data is above some level. That's one. However, what you're after is really the validation data, which is not used part of the training. The algorithm doesn't see that validation data. The validation data is purpose, just sitting there and evaluates your performance. So I have a training data which tells you at what point I'm going to stop the training. The validation data says, okay, this training is good because it works well on the validation data as well. So the validation data is not seen by the learning algorithm. Training data is used and seen by the training algorithm. The testing data is presumably something that simulates or emulates the real world. Something, of course, you haven't seen it, but most likely it's kind of not the validation data. Would be some other data, okay? Any questions? Any questions? Okay.